Hello and good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Kyle Ferrier. I'm a fellow and director of academic affairs at KEI, as well as your moderator for today's event. It's great to see so many people attending what will be a great program to help launch the thought-provoking paper written by our speaker. If you haven't seen it yet, I would highly encourage you to read it, which you can do so after the event through the link provided in the confirmation email, or you can do so on our website under the event for this, the link for this event, or under the publications tab. I think what makes this program so interesting is that it tackles the intersection of two key issues for South Korea. The first being the THAAD dispute with China, and the second being public diplomacy and soft power. Both are very important in their own right, but what I think our speaker does for us today is provide some insights into how the first impacted the second. Even though the worst of China's retaliation against South Korean companies over the deployment of the THAAD missile defense battery ended a few years ago, there's still so much to be learned from this incident, and we'll be approaching that shortly from a very interesting angle. But first, a little bit about our speaker, Maximilian Ernst. He is a PhD researcher in international security at the KFVUB Korea Chair, hosted by the Brussels School of Governance. He is the managing editor of Global Politics Review, and his dissertation for his PhD focuses on Chinese course of diplomacy in East Asia, which I think makes him particularly well suited for today's discussion. So with that, I'll turn things over to Maximilian to get us started.
Yes, thank you, Kyle, for the very kind introduction. I'm also right away share my screen, so you already have everything set up. It works. You see my screen, right? All right, perfect. So yeah, as I said, thanks for the very kind introduction, and good morning to people tuning in from DC, and good afternoon if you're tuning in from Europe, and good evening if this is your late night entertainment, your late night show if you're tuning in from Korea or somewhere else in Asia Pacific. Perhaps a few words where I'm coming from. Kyle already mentioned a few words about my PhD, but perhaps a bit more. So in my PhD dissertation, I look at Chinese coercive measures towards Asia-Pacific regional states. Specifically, I try to investigate how China justifies the strategic costs of coercion. So whenever China coerces, of course, there's a political or security related issue, but this coercion will also alienate the secondary state. And this is, of course, this may plausibly lead to a balancing decision by the target state of coercion, plausibly in coalition with the United States. And this is, of course, not in China's interest. And so I really try to understand why China, knowing this, why China still coerces then. And I also say this so that as a little bit disclaimer, I'm not a Korea expert so much. In my PhD, the level of analysis is China and Chinese foreign policy decision making. And what I do for this paper that I wrote, which was published yesterday at KEI, and which I will present today, is that I switch the level of analysis from Chinese foreign policy decision making to Korean foreign policy decision making. And therefore, without further ado, I think let's go into it, and then I think we will have a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll have another half an hour discussion. So let's start with the bottom line up front. The findings of my study are that South Korea's soft power has very clear limitations. The THAAD dispute demonstrates that soft power only works in absence of national security contentions. And this confirms the tenets of defensive realism, which maintains that actions by states in the international system are driven by their desire to maximize security. Another finding, though, is that at the same time, traditional diplomacy based on high-level summits has proven to work, notably in the presence of those very same national security contentions. Also, to get some definitions and disambiguations out of the way, soft power I define, or in fact Joseph Nye defines, as getting other states to want what you want. Public diplomacy, I understand as one approach to foreign policy that, among others, has the objective to build soft power. And the research question of my study is, did the target state of South Korea's soft power, and that in our case is China, develop any appreciation of South Korea's policy objectives, or did Beijing want what Seoul wants? Of course, South Korea had what would qualify as a public diplomacy all along, but since 2010, this was officially instituted as a means to govern foreign relations alongside state diplomacy and economic diplomacy. South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs is in charge of South Korea's public diplomacy, and since 2016, South Korea publishes a master plan for public diplomacy every 5 years, so once in every administration. And the budget for public diplomacy has been increasing. In 2020, it was at 31.5 billion Korean won. South Korea's public diplomacy, as we find it in the South Korea's diplomatic white paper, has 5 overarching objectives: to share Korean culture, to deepen foreign understanding of Korea, to gain global support for Korea's policies, to strengthen public diplomacy capacity, and to promote public-private partnership. Now, of course, as we briefly remember how Nye defined soft power, we see that number 3 here is pretty much not a definition, but it goes in the same direction: to gain global support or to get others to want what you want. You know, it's the same idea, right? Now, Korea has, soft power is of course much of a buzzword, and many people talk and write about it, and there are plenty of rankings for soft power, and South Korea usually ranks pretty good, pretty much in the on top of these, not on top, but not so bad. So here on the left, we have the Global Soft Power Index 2021, where South Korea ranks 11. And on the right side, we have the Soft Power 30, where it is number 19, however, number 2 among Asian states. Now, of course, this is highly arbitrary. And if you read these reports, what they measure is governance, technology, food, climate change policies, and so on and so forth. So these things, first of all, they're all different. There's no real unified methodology. And second, if we're honest, what these reports are assessing or quantifying here is, in fact, I think, a level of nation branding and probably a degree to which people in one country like another country. But it's questionable to me how that would translate into soft power. But of course, it's up for debate, and perhaps that will be part of our debate today later on. So briefly about South Korea's public diplomacy again. In its white paper, South Korea, a diplomatic white paper, South Korea ranks country or target countries of its public diplomacy by hierarchy, and China ranks up high. After the United States, it's number 2. After then, I believe Japan, and then other areas, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and so on and so forth. And here I have one quote. What South Korea's public diplomacy wants to do, it wants to take into account the different policy environment and public opinion of each major country to gain the public's understanding and to build recognition and consensus among overseas opinion leaders on Korea's major foreign policies. So this is really understanding what it's supposed to do, and then I think we again see the similarity to the narrow definition of soft power here. So again, that we understand where public diplomacy and soft power go together. This is not what our discussion today is about, but it's a very rich and interesting field. Is of course South Korea's media products and culture and how these are received in other countries, and of course these are very often seen as proxy for soft power. So we should at least briefly mention that this is a huge debate. That South Korean culture and media products are, of course, very popular in China, which, as I mentioned, is seen as an indicator for soft power. Perhaps just one historical reference: China approved South Korean media products, movies, and TV shows early on, already since the 1990s, earlier than most Western products. And even the term Hallyu, or Chinese Hanliu, stems from China and was then translated back into Korean and then since then used by the rest of the world. So this just goes to say that by all these accounts, we would expect South Korea to have plenty of soft power. Now, transition to the THAAD case. And I'm sure that most in the audience know about the THAAD case very well. I think it's a few years back in the past, and I'm gonna just pick the few issues and variables that are important for today's case study. And first, we'll look at what the strategic long-term interests of the 3 parties involved were. So the United States sought to improve cooperation on missile defense with regional allies and partners since the late 1990s already, primarily prompted by North Korea's improving, but back then still limited ICBM capabilities, as well as analysis that suggested that North Korea was developing nuclear weapons, of course. South Korea's position was that it needed to accommodate United States plans for missile defense, but of course also consider its own security requirements. And these US missile defense plans, they neglected North Korea's long-range artillery as well as North Korea's Air Force capabilities. So Seoul decided in 2001 that it wants to pursue the Korea Air Missile Defense System, KAMD. It would have been a bit cheaper, partly domestically produced, and there would have been other measures that would be more tailored towards South Korea's own security needs. There was also the variable that informed South Korea's decision of China. I don't think from my reading so far that it was high up there, but at least it was part of the discussion, is of course that by the early 2000s, China was already emerging as one of South Korea's most important economic partners. So when China said, we don't like this, it would have been just natural for South Korea to listen to this. And that brings me to the third party, of course, China, who saw global strategic stability threatened by regional states cooperating on US missile defense. Specifically, Beijing believed that improved US missile defense capabilities could undermine its nuclear deterrent. So just briefly, this is a much debated and also very interesting topic. Of course, as I hinted, there's a debate on whether THAAD really threatens China's nuclear deterrent, but the Chinese position is that THAAD interceptors based on the Korean Peninsula can, on the one hand, not intercept a Chinese ICBM, of course, but that its X-band radars, integrated with further ground-based interceptors in Japan, Alaska, and California, would enable the United States to first detect Chinese ICBMs launched early and therefore possess more opportunities or attempts to intercept, and second, to identify decoys in the early ascent phase of the ICBM, and then therefore also identify decoys. So the issue really would be the radars of THAAD. Such an additional radar on the Korean Peninsula integrated into a US global missile defense network would contribute to both dimensions, early detection and decoy identification, therefore allegedly improving the US ability to intercept Chinese ICBMs at the lowest possible interceptor per ICBM ratio. Now, a brief overview of how we came to the decision of South Korea to, in the end, deploy THAAD, because the United States was always clear and adamant that it wanted to cooperate with regional partners on missile defense, not just with South Korea, but also notably with Japan and with Australia. And China was always against it for the reasons that I just mentioned. So the important variable here really is how Seoul's decision from going with KMD to going with the American system in the end, how this came into being. And I think we can trace it back to late 2011 when Kim Jong-un assumed power in North Korea, and pretty much the next year, beginning with nuclear and ballistic missiles. And then over the next years, of course, as North Korea tested more ICBMs and nuclear weapons, the discussion of what to do about missile defense on the Korean Peninsula emerged again. I think there are many, many important events, but one tipping point I believe would be when USFK Commander Scaparotti advocated for a layered missile defense system based on Patriot and THAAD in January 2014. But then the Park administration still stuck to the so-called 3 no's. These 3 no's are: first, no official request by the United States; second, no negotiation with the United States; and third, that there was in the end no final decision by the Korean government. So this was the South Korean decision for the next 2 years. It was quite ambiguous. Of course, in the meantime, the discussion went on what to do about that, but the Park administration stayed stuck with these 3 no's. But then in January 2016, North Korea tested an ICBM and also a nuclear weapon, I think one in January, the other in February. And that led to the Park administration to engage in consultations with USFK over the coming months, which led to the official decision by July 2016 to deploy THAAD. And in April 2017, then deployment began. By May 2017, the first launches were operational. And by September, all launches were deployed and operational. So much for the timeline of deployment. Now looking on the Chinese side of this whole THAAD dispute. So in these years 2015-16, when the debate picked up, but there was no official decision, China used diplomatic protest more fervently, more often, pretty much every week, if not every day, and increased the diplomatic pressure. Then when in 2016, Seoul decided to revisit THAAD deployment and engage in consultations, China started to voice very strong opposition. Chinese Ministry of National Defense officials openly demanded that Seoul withdraws from deployment plans. And they warned that the critical situation on the Korean Peninsula would worsen if THAAD would be deployed. When then in July 2016, deployment was decided, Beijing escalated from mere diplomatic opposition and also engaged in economic coercion. The economic retaliation, or the largest part, the strongest episode of it, lasted about 14 months until October 2017, which is 2 months, of course, after the full deployment. But of course, some repercussions of economic coercion were felt months and years afterwards, and possibly even up until today. Although I think the whole pandemic makes it hard to discern which one is which, but it certainly, it was there. It continued the months and years after. And China's economic retaliation can be summarized in 3 categories. The first would be particularly grave sanctions against the conglomerate Lotte. Lotte, of course, as I'm sure most know, was singled out because it provided a golf course to USFK under the Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA. The primary tool of coercion were extraordinary tax investigations and sanitation checks against its business operations in China. These repressions resulted in a loss of 77% of Lotte Mart sales in China in the year 2017, and subsequent withdrawal from the Chinese market altogether of Lotte Mart. Also, other entities under the Lotte brand reported cases of extraordinary tax investigations, fines, delayed licensing approval, property seizure, and public boycotts. The entire economic damage against Lotte alone is estimated at $1.78 billion. The next was strong. The next category are strong sanctions against Korea's travel and entertainment industry. So prior to 2017, Chinese tourists amounted to 47% of overall tourist arrivals in Korea. So almost half of tourists to Korea were Chinese, and their expenditure in duty-free shops made up 80% of total duty-free turnover. In October 2016, so a few months after decision to deploy THAAD, the Chinese National Tourism Administration was ordered top-down from Beijing to issue travel warnings discouraging Chinese trips to Korea. It also instructed regional governments in China to liaise with local travel agencies in their jurisdiction to halt promotions of group tourism. Beijing further rejected chartered flights, so these are additional flights of the flights that already exist on the plans, of Korean carriers Asiana Airlines, Jin Air, and Jeju Air, as well as from Chinese airlines China Eastern and China Southern. By the end of 2017, tourist numbers to Korea had dropped by 48.3%, which translates into 4.5 million tourists. Duty-free operators were affected most profoundly, followed by hospitals and plastic surgery clinics, retail outlets, of course, Korean travel agencies, hotels, and casinos. Based on estimates by the Hyundai Research Institute, the economic losses to the Korean economy resulting from travel bans alone figured at $15.6 billion. And as for the entertainment industry, China, not surprisingly, is the largest foreign market for Korea's entertainment industry. But in fall 2016, the Chinese State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television formulated the Korean Performing Arts Activities Ban, restricting the streaming of Korean music, TV, and movies. Korean artists' concerts were cancelled, contracts withdrawn, and visas denied. Also, Korean game developers reported that they could not receive licenses for the Chinese gaming market, which is, of course, the largest market for gaming in the world. And for the last category, sporadic incitement of boycotts and bureaucratic scrutiny against Korean enterprises without proven but with likely involvement of the Chinese government. There's to be mentioned, for example, Korean car battery manufacturers SGI and LG Chem, which were excluded from the Chinese e-mobility market in 2017. Furthermore, Chinese citizens engaged in boycotts against Korean car makers Hyundai and Kia, as well as against Korean artists. Hyundai and Kia, the car maker operations of these conglomerates, lost 47% of their Chinese market share in 2017, translating into an 8.7% loss in global sales. There were further reports about Chinese customs authorities applying especially high scrutiny against Korean shipments, resulting in delays and increased costs of Korean companies. Now let's see how the Moon government, once in power, managed the relations with China. So as I'm sure most have the timeline in their head, in their mind, there were elections in Korea in 2017, and by May 2017, I think May 10, President Moon was inaugurated, and he then announced to reevaluate THAAD. That was one of his campaign promises, not to get rid of it, but to look at the necessity and also the environmental impact. And during this assessment, the deployment of THAAD was also halted. From my reading of Chinese press releases and so on, this was seen as an opportunity by China to perhaps halt deployment, but of course this didn't materialize, because once the Korean Ministry of Environment decided that there is no impact on the South Korean environment and also the population, mostly by the radars, deployment went on. Then in September 2017, one THAAD was fully deployed. Seoul, however, engaged with Beijing to rebuild the relationship. On September 20, there was an important meeting between Minister Kang Kyung-hwa and Minister Wang Yi at the United Nations in New York, where Minister Kang importantly formulated the new 3 no's. That would be, there would be no trilateral alliance with the United States and Japan. That is important because China was always sort of worried about this coalition of these 3 countries against it. That there would further be no additional THAAD units in addition to the 6 that were already deployed, and that there would be no participation by South Korea on US region-wide missile defense. President Moon furthermore expressed the wish to restore Korea-China relations in a live TV interview on September 28, 2017, and there was an immediate positive response by the Chinese ambassador to South Korea, Chiu Kuo-hong. And then from October 2017 onwards, there was we saw a gradual lifting of travel restrictions and the bans on Korean entertainment products. But of course, as I mentioned, the repercussions of these economic coercion were felt in the months and years afterwards. And for some industries, including Lotte, but of course also car makers, some market shares were irreversibly lost, of course. Now, I think we can now move towards the conclusion and ask, when do public diplomacy and soft power not work, and why? So if we remember again, Joseph Nye's narrow definition of soft power allows to put South Korean soft power, and by proxy its public diplomacy, to the test. Let's also keep in mind that the Korean public diplomacy has the stated objective to gain global support for Korea's policies. So we then can ask, what support, if any, did China, its leaders and its citizens develop for Korea's policies? Or put differently, did Seoul get Beijing to want what Seoul wanted? Beijing's economic retaliation demonstrates that South Korea's public diplomacy targeted at China had little, if any, results in terms of building the sort of Joseph Nye soft power. Importantly, neither the Chinese leadership nor the population grew meaningful appreciation of South Korea's security political predicaments, in this case, the need to deploy THAAD. Chinese economic retaliation was executed top-down from the central government, delegated to regional governments, and executed by Chinese private enterprises and at least parts of the Chinese public. I mentioned this I emphasized the Chinese public because I think it's important to understand that these were not Chinese people with very hard national feelings, but these were the very people who would otherwise have traveled to Korea, gone to K-pop concerts, and so on and so forth. This is not about blaming China or smearing China, but it's again, it's about substantiating my argument that soft power in certain cases doesn't work, right? We have to keep in mind other countries also sanction. I just keep in mind Germany every 3-4 years might put travel restrictions on Turkey if there's an internal issue, and then of course you will also see a drop of German tourists going to Turkey. So this is not, I'm not saying here that what China does is outrageous or never seen, but the argument here is one about investigating the limits of public diplomacy and soft power. There are two possible conclusions to be drawn from the THAAD case on public diplomacy and soft power, and that is first, either South Korea's public diplomacy did not succeed in building the type of soft power that meets nice narrow threshold of getting others to want what you want, or second, South Korea's public diplomacy was able to foster soft power, but a confounding variable, in this case the THAAD dispute, limited its effects. This allows me to hypothesize that the limit of one country's public diplomacy reaches as far as another country's core security interests. Put differently, public diplomacy works in absence of security contentions, but collapses the moment that the target country's national security is challenged by actions of the sending state. In the case of THAAD, China's security was threatened by improved US capabilities to intercept Chinese ICBMs, potentially undermining China's nuclear deterrent. But the THAAD case also demonstrates what works instead. Traditional diplomacy executed by government officials and diplomats during summits, high-level meetings, and state visits, negotiating treaties, signing MOUs, and offering quid pro quos in order to accommodate each other's core interests. South Korea was able to have the cake and eat it too. The US missile defense system was deployed and relations with Beijing were rebuilt. Seoul's top diplomats under the Moon administration were able to convince their Chinese counterparts that THAAD, as far as South Korea was concerned, was only aimed at North Korea, and that Seoul would not undertake further actions that threatens China's national security. The new 3 no's, as I mentioned before. And that brings us to the last slide and the key takeaways. Those would be soft power and to a degree public diplomacy, but again, these are connected but different concepts, only work in absence of national security contestations. I put only in italics because this is just one case study. We have to talk about this, but this is the takeaway from this case study. Furthermore, traditional diplomacy, and that is summits and negotiations, works even when there are such security contentions. And finally, US allies can, in principle, maintain their security alliance with the United States and maintain stable economic relations with China. This is not to say that this is what they should do, because of course we have to keep in mind that close economic relations, overly close economic relations with China increase vulnerability to economic coercion. So this is not me saying that US allies or just anyone really should have overly close economic relations with China, but it's possible. And perhaps we can also lead it, because this is the last slide, but of course, keeping in mind my research now, I specifically wrote here US allies. We talk a lot about, of course, about Asia, but I think this is the same as to be said about European allies or just really every liberal democracy in the world. That of course it's possible to have your good relations with the United States and China, and whether that's a good idea is another question which is not addressed by my research today. And that's it. And I'm looking forward to questions and discussions. And I'm gonna briefly see to unshare. 1 second. Okay, sorry, that took a moment, but I think we're done. I didn't find the button.
We have plenty of time for the
Perfect.
discussion. Thank you so much for that great presentation. I think it was super detailed, but a lot more is in your paper. I definitely encourage people to check that out afterwards if they're interested in learning a lot more about the details of the THAAD dispute and what the sort of diplomacy was in there. And I think you have a really great timeline built into the paper about all the different back and forth the Moon government did, which really sort of sheds more light on the amount of diplomacy that really went into resolving the THAAD issue on South Korea's side. But I just want to, I see that there's some questions coming into the queue. I would encourage everyone, if you have a question, to please write it in using the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. Unfortunately, we're not able to switch to your video if you raise hands. So I would encourage you to please type in your your question in the Q&A function, and we'll get to it in a moment. But I'm going to take advantage of my position as moderator to ask some questions first to get the conversation going. And just to start off simply, what is the key takeaway from all this that you think for the many scholars who work on Korean soft power and public diplomacy, including those who may be listening in right now?
Yeah, thanks, Kai. Great question. So I think we should perhaps I think, as you see from my presentation, and if you read the papers, that if I claim that the soft power and public diplomacy has these clear limitations, is that I'm somewhat, I wouldn't say critical of the concept, but that I'm cautious in using it. But to perhaps also start saying is that what I also think is, if I from what I read so far on the discussions on soft power, Korean soft power, I think it's a highly interesting topic. But I think what we very often see, there's of course discussions about the popularity of Korean culture and media products and so on. And I think this phenomenon is high. So at least part of the discussion is that. And so I think I first want to get this out of the way and say this is a highly fascinating topic, right? To understand why Korea and that Korea is so popular, and also what this means for Korean interest and so on and so forth. But I think if we talk about soft power, I'm not saying that there's the concept doesn't have merit, but I think it might be useful to avoid so-called concept stretching, and that if you're really just talking, I mean, the word soft power has the word power in it, right? So the question is really, what does that mean? And if we're just talking about Korea being popular and Korean brands and products being popular, which is great and which is interesting, but what does that have to do with power? So this is perhaps my not saying there is no power, but I think this is sort of the argument against which you should always which you should falsify, and then perhaps show there is actual power, and that it really these inherent Korean soft power values, or whatever you call it, it actually is able to influence for other countries' decision making. And I think this is a very high standard, and I'm happy to read research that demonstrates that that's possible. But and my research is probably to say a challenge to this idea that you can reliably influence other countries' decision making just by being popular.
Thank you. I guess the second question I'd like to ask before we turn over to the audience is that there's clearly a hole in the middle of all of this. You focus primarily on China's actions and policy shortcomings in relationship to the THAAD retaliation. But the hole in this, as I say, is the lack of U.S. support for Korea, even though THAAD was done under the auspices, under the umbrella of the U.S.-Korea alliance. There was just very little, if any, U.S. support for South Korea, even though a stated objective of U.S. policy in the region is to protect allies and partners from Chinese economic coercion. There was a lot of activity in other areas, but not so much for Korea. Do you think that the outcome might have been any different, swayed in any way, shape, or form, had there been a movement like what we see now in Australia to purchase Australian wine in the face of Chinese economic coercion?
Yeah. So I think there's two dimensions of the question, and I think it's very important. So I think the first thing that I see here is, should the United States have done something differently? I think, you know, what you just hinted at the Australian wine thing is these kind of symbols, they go a long way, right, in ensuring allies. So I think, yes, this is certainly something that the United States could have done, but the question is, would it have done anything in the real economic hard term sense? And then I think perhaps not. If you think at the kind of coercion that we look here, especially tourists and you know, Korean cars not being bought by Chinese customers, this is not something that you can easily from 1 month to the next alleviate, right? So in fact, the market forces took care of this by themselves, right? Once the Chinese tourists didn't come in 2017, of course, Korean travel agencies, they advertised their travel products to other markets. I think Japan and Southeast Asia was very big in there. And then, of course, in the next travel season, you would have these people coming, and this mitigated these effects, of course. But in the immediate effect, so to go back to your question, is there's not so much that you could have done with, for example, wine, because if you are an avid wine drinker and this happens, you're European, you're American, this happens, and then you can just buy Australian wine the next week, but you cannot reschedule your family holiday or your car sale. So this just goes to say that, you know, the symbolism of saying we have your back, yes, that goes a long way, but really mitigating such strong economic effects, I think is difficult. So that's my assessment. So there we have to be honest and of course say this is difficult. But perhaps another thing is, and then that's something that I'm also on the side of my PhD a little bit exploring, is of course, so what the United States can do, and I think I would take the European Union here also into, I mean, not that I have a say in this, but I think there would really be a value if liberal democracies understand that, you know, the individual smaller countries are vulnerable to Chinese economic coercion. It happens, it's demonstrated, and that these kind of, you know, that if we use processes through the WTO or otherwise, that may help us, of course, you know, liberal democracies in Asia Pacific and the Americas and Europe to, in the way a little bit of what you suggest, but there could be more duly processes to respond to these coercion. So I'm very open and very interested in this, and perhaps this, yeah, that's my response.
I think that was an important point to make. There's only so many other actors can do, especially as it relates to market forces. I have another question. I have more questions, but it seems as if our audience does as well. So I'm going to at least stop here temporarily and turn it over to the long line of questions and comments that we have coming in from the audience. And I'll start with the first one we have here. It seems that Chinese opposition to THAAD was similar to the Russian opposition to US missile defense in the EU. The person asks, they heard that the Russian engineers knew that US missile defense was not a threat to Russia, but the Russian politicians continue to oppose US missile defense. Do you know if the situation was similar in China? If their engineers knew that THAAD was not a threat to China, sort of the technical experts knew that THAAD was not a threat to China, but the Chinese politicians continue to oppose it?
Mm-hmm. I don't know, but I don't know what Chinese and Russian engineers think and do, and I also don't know what their politicians think, but we sometimes know what they do. What I know, perhaps that's not the question, but what I observed in my research so far is that China and Russia, to a degree, coordinated among each other on global missile defense, because the United States, this is not what I brought here, but in fact, the United States incentivized allies in both Europe and the in Asia to cooperate on missile defense, and China and Russia coordinated on being jointly opposed to this. So this is what I know. But I'm actually, I think, to be honest, I think that although I think South Korea should have, and the United States should have the missile defense network that they need for their security. But from my observation of Chinese sources and analysis is that I'm quite confident, to be honest, that Chinese worries about US missile defense capabilities are justified. So again, this is not a statement about whether you should probably still deploy a missile defense system if you see the desire to do so, but it is not. This is not a fake argument from what I see, because if we look at, and this is precisely what I, as I mentioned before, what I express in address in my PhD, that Chinese coercion has huge costs, right? I mean, if we look at Korea, but also in the Southeast Asia, this coercion that China did towards Korea and also towards other Southeast Asian states, it really leads to these states considering their hedging position and to not potentially go more towards balancing against China. And China knows this. And if China is ready to accept these huge strategic costs, for me, that is it's not proof, but it sounds to me that China not just maintains that it's against the missile defense system, it's really worried about this. So that's my knowledge so far. But I know that from what I read, I'm not the only one who thinks that. Yeah.
Our next question comes in asking, with the negative economic effects to South Korea more regional than general? For instance, is local/regional economies like that of Jeju or Jeju Island were heavily dependent not only on Chinese tourism, but also the large amount of real estate investments from China that drove speculative property values higher, which was withdrawn due to the boycott, resulting in dramatic drop in the real estate market. So more or less, can you go over like sort of the breakdown of the regional versus overall national economic impact?
It's a great question, but I think the answer is more or less already in there. So this is not for me, for my research. This is not at the core of my question, but yes, it's already. I think we certainly these areas naturally that depend on tourism were more affected by this. Of course, so that's true. From little what I read in this dimension, it's precisely as Robert Gay hints here, and also I think what we have to keep in mind is there was also, of course, if we have Chinese, if we have the factories of Hyundai and Kia, if they were affected in China, then of course it wasn't even a Korean region in any specific ways, but it was really just the conglomerate, which wouldn't affect so much Korean workers. It would be Chinese workers in that case, which is another dimension interesting. So it might even affect, interestingly, Chinese workers who were working for a Korean car factory, right? But certainly you will have different regional and industry sectors affected more than others.
Great. Next question comes in from Gil Rosman. A series of questions which I'm going to try to string together while also sort of connecting it to something else I wanted to talk about. But Gil asks, have you perhaps misjudged China? They show a low interest in soft power, and there's still pressure on South Korea. And even before THAAD, there was the China Korea culture wars between the two countries. You could think about the Goryeo incident.
Okay.
And can China turn soft power on and off? It shows. But that's what is. You talk a lot about China, Korea, and soft power. What about China and soft power?
Okay. Okay. So I'm not researching Chinese soft power, but I think so. I really can't get into it. Although I think the what I read so far, based on my knowledge, it's widely acknowledged that China doesn't have much in the way of soft power, and that China really relates on its hard power, and that of course includes economic hard power. But if you use your economic leverage, even if it's carrots not sticks, but that's still not soft power. You're bribing other countries, for example, in the Southeast Asian context, be it Cambodia, for example, in the to influence ASEAN decision making. But that's not soft power, right? It's bribing politicians or giving someone. That's still hard. So China doesn't have much in the way of soft power, and that's, I think, in the soft power literature what I read so far. This is largely accepted. But perhaps if I also understand Mr. Rossman's question regarding the culture wars, but excuse me if I got the question wrong here, is I think I know what you're referring to, and this of course exists, but what we need to keep in mind is that and I'm sorry if I misunderstood the question, is China is an important market for Korean culture and media products. It was before THAAD, and it was again after THAAD. And even though I think these culture wars may exist, but Korea was popular in China, and you really saw this in the travel and the tourist industries. And if you look at the popularity of Korean artists in China, of course, just by mere numbers, this really trumped every other region or market. I hope I answered the question, but if not, write me an email later.
I'm sure he will if he wants to follow up. Yeah. Moving on to the next question. The U.S. pressured South Korea to deploy THAAD, even though, as this person argues, there's minimal defense for South Koreans. Is this an exercise of U.S. hard power overcoming sentiments of Koreans? Is this sort of the alliance politics overcoming South Korean public opinion?
Well, I think what I observed is that there was a certain, I wouldn't call it a divide, but there were certain two camps in Korea. A few were for the missile defense system and a few were against it. The United States was always, it was consistent about saying we want this since the late 1990s. And I think the United States were consistent in their approach. They didn't pressure South Korea overly, more than saying, look, this is because we have to keep in mind the United States maintains a troop presence of 28,000, I believe, or I might be wrong. So it's just natural for the United States that it wants to protect its own military personnel, its military assets on the South Korean peninsula, and it's a normal process for two allies to negotiate about what is deployed and what is not deployed. The interesting thing here, perhaps it's not directly in the question, is that, I mean, as I hinted before, is the South Koreans were against THAAD or back in the 1990s, THAAD was somewhere in the air, but of course the missile defense system was not fully developed. But they were against US missile defense for a variety of reasons. One of them was costs, and the other one was it didn't directly cater to their security needs. So what we really have to understand is that once Kim Jong-un started to test these missiles, and the United States were more anxious to have a missile defense system, the United States and this is very often not covered in the news, is that the United States said we're going to pay for it, because this was not on the table before. And in my understanding, the Park administration then said, okay, if you pay for it, who are we to tell you not to deploy your system? We are allies. You can do. You have the ability to deploy military hardware on the South Korean peninsula to protect your own assets. And if you pay for it, fine. So this was the Park administration position. Of course, we know that international politics is a bit more complicated, but this was really, in my understanding, how the situation developed, and that's why I don't think the US overly pressured it. I mean, South Korea could still have said we don't want it, but at the end, South Korea said we get a free missile defense system. Otherwise, it would have. I forgot the number, but it's a dear number of millions of US dollars. So that's my understanding of how it went down there, at least partly.
Okay, great. Next question coming in here says, what are some sanctions from the THAAD dispute that still remain today in Korea? And how can South Korea and other countries guard themselves better from Chinese economic coercion, which seems to be increasingly gaining leverage in foreign relations? I know you have some of this in your paper when it comes down to what sanctions sort of are still there on South Korean companies with that dispute, but I'll let you take it from here.
Right. Yes. So, right. What we can say is that once the Moon administration engaged in rebuilding the relationship with China, right, it was not immediately back to normal. So what we really say is that the trend was towards, that the Chinese travel industries step by step removed those bans, and Chinese tourists were step by step coming back. And I think this was, I'm not so for the numbers is that Chinese tourists never went back to where they were before THAAD, but I'm not entirely sure there if it's not also because what I mentioned before is I certainly it's part because simply tourists come from other countries. So you know, use Korean hotels. I mean, this is very simplistic. They just have a limited number of beds, right? So if it's occupied by people from Japan and from Southeast Asia, other parts of Asia and the world, and if you simply have your advertisement strategy towards these markets, then you will have less Chinese. But it's certainly what we know is Chinese tourist numbers never went back to where they were before. And of course, certain industry of Korea, like plastic surgery or the duty-free shops, the K-beauty market, and so on and so forth, they will of course be affected, because as we saw, those were 80% of the duty-free operation was entertained by Chinese customers. So these things, they certainly they continued all the way down. And the other ones is that I mentioned, of course, is these not traceable, but actually quite. I mean, we're quite sure that these battery factories in China that were not built. Of course, this is you can't quantify it. You know, it never happened, right? It's a gray zone, but these are potentially billions of dollars that these Korean conglomerates could have gained, of course, in the Chinese market. So you know, it's these things are difficult to quantify. There's a recent Bank of Korea study, which I think is very good on some of these issues. Perhaps, but not today, I suppose, or not in this session. So I hope this answers some of the question. And I think there was another, or was that the whole question? I think that's it, right?
I think you addressed it pretty well.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
We have a multi-parter question coming in through the chat. The person asks, I was wondering if you have any information explaining how Beijing assessed and selected its retaliatory measures over the THAAD deployment. What decision-making process, what if you know of any decision-making processes when China selected which industries to impose economic sanctions, and conversely, what was China's decision process in terms of reconciliation, timing, and how to approach the lifting of sanctions? Did the Trump administration factor into this at all in terms of prompting the Chinese decision to reconcile with Seoul? Do you know, again, about Chinese decision to impose sanctions, withdraw sanctions, and was the US involved in any way, shape, or form, either directly or indirectly?
Yeah. Okay. I think there are a few dimensions. So let me see if I catch them all. So when it comes to which industries are selected, what to my knowledge, China likes to take industries. So travel is very popular because there's no. So usually in economic relation is there's interdependent, right? But the good thing about travel is it's not. So it doesn't hurt you if you don't send, and that's something that China is able to do more than most other countries. But as I hinted, even Germany sometimes puts Turkey or another country on a certain list. But for China, it's first through sending these travel bans and this influence on these regional travel agencies. China is probably more than most countries on this planet able to really direct and therefore leverage tourism flows. So that's why you always see tourism. It's also in the case with the Philippines, for example. This was one of the first things. The other things that China uses, so perhaps going out of the Korean case and more generally speaking, is there's some. But the THAAD case pretty much, but hints in that direction is that China uses, or at least parts of the. So we talk about decision making here. It's not just the government, that there are interest groups within China that it's not really clear to what extent they have an influence on the government. That, for example, if we look at the battery producers, right, this is something that of course helps Chinese domestic car battery producers, so that you choose there something that really helps. I mean, if we look at it again from the macro perspective, these are mercantilistic interests, right? That you basically you can sort of combine economic coercion to influence policy decision making in one country with your own mercantilistic approaches of perhaps shielding your own domestic industries against foreign competitors. So that's perhaps there. And a last dimension I would say is that China likes to, of course, use import bans more than export bans. It tried to use export bans on raw materials against Japan, and that, I mean, allow me the judgment that it backfired in the sense that Japan simply started to diversify its its supply routes, and now it's, Beijing stands there with its raw materials and has no leverage at all. So so this is why Beijing likes to use import bans more than export bans. And the other dimension of the question, China's decision. Okay, so I think, yeah, the timing, I think if I didn't cover this in my presentation or in the paper clearly enough, if you go to the coercion literature, there's one thing that's very important about that coercion works, is that the target of coercion first understands that it's being coerced, that something is an issue at all, and second, to give it a way to go to make coercion stop, and to fulfill whatever policy objective or what requirement the sending state of coercion has. And what is of course special about China is that the way how China does sanctions or economic coercion is a bit different to the Western world, because let's say in a liberal democracy in Europe or the United States, this goes through Congress, and then it's it's debated upon, and somewhere you see on the foreign ministry, you see a press statement saying this is the sanction against this state, and this needs to be done, and then sanctions will be lifted. I mean, I'm sure most in the audience know about sanction against North Korea, and everybody can look it up. But this is not the case how it's usually done for China. So China does not on its websites, on the foreign ministry website, say we are coercing South Korea. This is what we are unhappy about. This is what South Korea needs to do for coercion to stop. And and that's why the Chinese foreign ministry does it through. It basically says there is no coercion at all, but the Chinese people are unhappy about this situation, and you will see for yourself, so to say. And then briefly on timing, that of course allows China that the timing is much more immediate, right? Because as I just hinted, in a Western country, it might take weeks or months until something like this is decided. And in China, it's really able to have the timing immediately, which helps the coercive effort, so to say.
And I'm going to squeeze in one last question here with the 2 minutes we have left. The last question, the person's asking, do you think that the anti-China sentiment in South Korea, which has been intensifying in recent weeks and months, has its roots in the THAAD dispute? To what extent does the THAAD dispute play out in the current cultural controversies that we have rising between South Korea and China?
So I saw the results of questionnaires on the South Korean population, and if I understand, it had its impact. But of course, from as a social scientist, you can say it's difficult to say then to what extent these variant factors that they are, if it's really there. But I think this certainly, I can't say what the everyday South Korean person thinks, and to what level THAAD informs their perspective on China. But I think I think certainly the government, even though the Moon government for economic reasons sought to amend the relation, I think there's certainly more caution in the South Korean government, because they certainly learned their lesson. And I think the lesson in the sense that economic coercion with China has upsides but also downsides. But again, to your question, I think certainly it is in the, if you allow me this term, in the collective memory of the Chinese population. It's certainly there, right? This THAAD retribution, but it's difficult for me to quantify what's there more. One of which is most heavy.
Yeah, it's tough, but it's certainly definitely
it's there. Yeah,
it's a relevant factor.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Maximilian. We're out of time. Before we go, I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow, April 28th at 2 p.m., premiering on YouTube, KEI is also having another event entitled South Korea's Partnership with NATO, Origins and Future Direction. This is going to be a conversation between KEI President Mark Tokala and NATO's Director of Security Policy and Partnerships, James H. Mackey, on how the Korea-NATO partnership began and how it's evolving in response to challenges old and new. I think there's some overlap between our European colleague being here today and the NATO discussion tomorrow. So I would encourage you if you're interested in learning more about that, to tune in tomorrow. But Maximilian, this has been fantastic. Did a great job with the presentation and handling those very tough questions. I'm sure there's much more that we can do to keep the conversation going, but looking forward to continuing that offline. And so thank you again for joining us here today.